Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so let's get right into it. This deep dive you wanted to do, we're going back to the 70s, specifically to Jimmy Carter's presidency and his, I guess, kind of radical at the time, idea to make human rights a key part of U.S. foreign policy. You give us this great episode from Mr. Hutchings History called Jimmy Carter's Quest for Human Rights, a balancing act of morality in Realpolitik. And I'm really excited to talk about it with our expert. I have a feeling this is going to be one of those aha moments that you love.
Oh yeah, it's a really interesting time, especially because the way Carter approached this was such a shift from what was normal. You know, the big thing back then was realpolitik. Basically, that national interests were always number one, even if that meant ignoring some pretty bad stuff happening in other countries. But after Vietnam, there was this kind of disillusionment, you know? Like,
Yeah.
America was asking itself some tough questions about its place in the world. Carter really tapped into that feeling, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yeah, totally. So it's 1977. Carter comes into office. America is still trying to figure out Vietnam. What was the mood like back then? Do you think people were ready for this new way of doing foreign policy?
Imagine a country going through an existential crisis.
Yeah.
You know, there's this feeling of being morally exhausted. People were questioning whether what America was doing out in the world was actually making things better. And that's when Carter steps in and he says, hey, we have to stand for something more than just power. We got to stand up for human rights. You know, it was a pretty big deal.
It does sound like it, but how did he actually put that into action? Because saying you care about human rights is one thing, but actually doing something is a whole other thing, right?
Oh, you're totally right. And Carter was serious about this. One of the most important things he did was put out this thing on Presidential Directive 30. This was huge because for the first time ever, the U.S. was saying, we're not just going to support any dictator who says they're on our side. We care about how they treat their people. It was basically him telling the State Department, hey, when you're deciding who gets aid from us, you need to factor in their human rights record. No more blank checks for dictators.
Wow. So he was actually cutting off aid to dictators. That's a pretty big step. What was the reaction like? Was there pushback from people in the
Well,
government?
there was definitely some, from people who were really worried about national security and from people who liked the old way of doing things. But Carter was really committed to this. He wanted human rights to be a core part of U.S. foreign policy. He didn't stop at Presidential Directive 30 either. He created some special groups within the government, like the Human Rights Coordinating Group and the Global Issues Group.
So he was building like a whole system inside the government to really focus on this. What did those groups actually do?
Think of them as like the eyes and ears of his administration. They were there to make sure human rights were always on the table. They kept track of what was going on around the world, and they made sure those concerns were part of the conversation when the U.S. was making foreign policy decisions. It was all about making human rights a constant factor, not just something you bring up when it's convenient.
It sounds like he was trying to change the whole culture inside the government to make human rights a central issue.
Yeah.
But what about the international stage? How did he try to push human rights outside U.S. borders?
He had a multi-pronged approach. He used existing agreements like the Helsinki Accords, which, you know, connected human rights with international cooperation. He used that to pressure the Soviets, basically saying, hey, if you want to work with the West, you need to improve how you're treating your people. But he also went further than that. He called out dictatorships publicly, even some that were supposed to be U.S. allies.
That must have caused some problems. Can you think of any examples where he really took a stand?
Oh, he was very outspoken about the dictatorships in Latin America, especially Pinochet in Chile. This was a big deal because the U.S. had actually helped put Pinochet in power. So for Carter to come out and condemn him for violating human rights, it was a huge change from how things had been done before.
Yeah, this is what we were talking about, right? This tension between doing the right thing and doing what's strategically good for the country. It seems like Carter was trying to find a really difficult balance.
Absolutely. And his stance on Pinochet, that wasn't just symbolic either. It had a big impact all over the world.
So what were the real results? Did his words lead to any actual improvements on the ground?
One of the biggest things was that it raised awareness globally. By shining a light on these dark places, Carter made people pay attention, and it gave people fighting for their rights more courage. Think about Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia. They specifically mention Carter's stance on human rights as their inspiration. It's like he gave them the okay to speak out, to demand better from their government. And in Chile, he pressured Pinochet to shut down the DNA. That was their secret police force, known for being incredibly brutal.
That's a real accomplishment. It wasn't just words. He was actually using U.S. influence to push for change.
Exactly. And we saw similar stuff happening in other Latin American countries, maybe not as dramatic, but Argentina's military junta, they started to be more careful about how they repressed people. Because of the international pressure that Carter helped create, they knew the world was watching, so they had to be more cautious. Even if they didn't completely change what they were doing.
It sounds like he was making some real progress. But the podcast also talked about how there were inconsistencies in his approach. It seems like he wasn't always willing to put the same kind of pressure on countries that were allies of the U.S.
Right. He was tough on the Soviets and some of the Latin American regimes, but he kind of looked the other way when it came to human rights abuses in places like Saudi Arabia and Israel. Those were important allies of the U.S., and this is where it gets really complicated. You got to remember the context. This is the middle of the Cold War. And everything was seen through that lens. Stopping communism was the most important thing. And sometimes that meant making deals with some pretty bad people.
So that's the realpolitik dilemma again. National interest versus doing what's right. Like he's trying to balance these two things that are pulling him in opposite directions. So how did the Cold War affect his human rights agenda?
Well, let's take Nicaragua, for example. In 1979, the Sandinistas, they were revolutionaries. They overthrew Somoza. He was the dictator there. And he was backed by the U.S. The Sandinistas were leftists, aligned with Cuba and the Soviet Union. And that really worried Carter because of the Cold War. So he authorized covert operations to try to undermine the Sandinistas. Even though they had a lot of support from the people, he also kept sending military aid to the government in El Salvador. They were pretty repressive, but they were fighting against leftist rebels.
That seems like a contradiction. Compared to all his talk about human rights, it's like he was trying to have it both ways.
It shows you how hard it is to balance your ideals with the reality of Cold War politics. And to be fair to Carter, he wasn't the only one struggling with this. It's a problem that's been a part of U.S. foreign policy for a long time, even today.
It makes you wonder if it's even possible for a country to have a truly ethical foreign policy when you have to deal with all the complexities of the world.
That's the big question, isn't it? And I think Carter's presidency shows us just how hard it is to find that balance. But even though he didn't always succeed, he did change the conversation. He forced the U.S. and the rest of the world to really think about human rights in a way they hadn't before.
So even if he didn't always live up to his own ideals, he raised the bar.
Exactly. He made it much harder to just ignore human rights abuses, even if realpolitik concerns often won out in the end. And you can see this in how historians view Carter's legacy. The Mr. Hutchings History podcast lays out the different perspectives really well. It's interesting how there's no one clear agreement on his record when it comes to human rights.
Right. Some historians think Carter was naive, like he didn't really understand how the world worked, while others say he was trying to change the rules of the game to make morality matter. So there's a whole range of opinions. Can you walk us through some of those different viewpoints?
Sure. You have the traditionalists. They're often diplomatic historians. They argue that Carter's focus on human rights actually made the U.S. weaker, and that it hurt its influence in the world. They think he underestimated how brutal the Cold War really was, and that his idealism ended up backfiring.
So they put realpolitik above ethical concerns. What about the revisionists? They seem to have a more positive view of Carter.
Yeah, the revisionists see Carter's emphasis on human rights as something that was necessary, a break from the policies of the past, which they saw as lacking morals. They think he brought a much-needed ethical dimension to U.S. foreign policy, and that his efforts, even if they weren't always successful, helped to create a more humane world order.
So they see him as someone with a vision, even if he was ahead of his time.
Right. And then you have the post-revisionists. They offer a more nuanced perspective. They argue that Carter's policies, even with their flaws, contributed to the growing importance of human rights in international relations. They see his presidency as a step toward a world where human rights really matter, even if that world is still a long way off.
It's interesting how all these different viewpoints make sense in their own way. It really shows how complex Carter's legacy is.
It does. And then there are the historians who specifically study human rights. They tend to see Carter's presidency as a turning point, a key moment in the global movement for human rights. They argue that what he did, even with all the inconsistencies, helped to energize activists and organizations all over the world and lead the foundation for future progress. Samantha Power, for instance. She argues that Carter helped build the infrastructure for future work on human rights, even if he couldn't always deliver on his promises when he was in office.
It's fascinating how his legacy is still being debated. But in the end, what was the real impact of Carter's focus on human rights? Did it really change anything?
That's a great question, and it doesn't have an easy answer. But I think it's fair to say that Carter's legacy is mixed. Yeah, there were inconsistencies and failures, sometimes because of the Cold War, sometimes because of opposition within the U.S. itself. But there's no question that he changed the conversation. He made the U.S. and the rest of the world really confront the issue of human rights in a way they hadn't before.
Yeah, he made it harder to just ignore those abuses, even if realpolitik often won out. It's like he planted a seed that would keep growing, even if it didn't fully bloom while he was president.
Exactly. And don't forget that his commitment to human rights, it didn't end when he left the White House. He started the Carter Center, which has done some amazing work promoting democracy and human rights and helping to resolve conflicts all over the world.
Yeah, that shows how sincere he was, even if he had to make some tough compromises during his presidency. It's like he learned from those compromises and kept fighting for what he believed in, even after he wasn't president anymore.
Absolutely. His work after he left office, it shows that he never gave up trying to make a difference in people's lives. It's a good reminder that even when we face setbacks, we can keep pushing for a better world.
It really is inspiring to see that kind of dedication. So to bring it back to what you asked about at the beginning, it seems like Carter's attempt to make human rights a central part of U.S. foreign policy. It was a really ambitious goal, but it ran into some serious roadblocks. He wanted to put morality first, but he had to deal with the realities of the Cold War.
Yeah, he was walking a tightrope for sure. And that tension between ideals and practicality, it's something that still affects U.S. foreign policy today.
It makes you think, what if Carter were president now, facing all the challenges we have in the world today? How would he approach human rights? Would he be more successful? Or would he face the same kinds of problems, just in different ways?
That's an interesting question. The world has changed a lot since the 70s. The Cold War is over, but we have new things to worry about now, like terrorism, climate change, the rise of authoritarian leaders. It's a really complicated world.
And the ways we do diplomacy have changed, too. Think about social media, activists and human rights groups. They have all these new ways to organize and put pressure on governments.
It's a whole new game.
Yeah, it really is.
And the U.S. itself is different, too. Public opinion about getting involved in other countries has changed, and people are more aware of the unintended consequences of military action.
So it's hard to say what a President Carter 2.0 would do, but it's something to think about.
It definitely is, and it reminds us that human rights aren't just some abstract idea. They're about real people, their lives, their freedom, their dignity. And finding ways to protect those rights in a world that's often dangerous and complicated, that's one of the biggest challenges we face.
Totally agree. It's a challenge that needs our attention all the time. We need to think critically and be willing to ask tough questions.
Yeah.
There aren't any easy answers, but it's definitely something worth struggling with.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, this has been a really interesting deep dive into Jimmy Carter and human rights. Thanks for helping us understand it all. I think we both had some of those aha moments we were hoping for.
You're welcome. I'm always happy to explore these complicated topics.
And for everyone listening, we hope this made you curious about human rights and foreign policy. It's a story that's still unfolding. And we'll be back with more deep dives into other fascinating subjects. So keep asking those questions.
And keep diving deeper.
Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.